When Aria disappeared after ballet practice, the entire city was thrown into fear. But what I uncovered after 11 years wasn't an explanation. It was a much darker secret than I ever imagined. A tattoo on an unidentified body, a mentor lurking in the shadows, controlling her every step. I uncovered the truth they tried to bury, a case that was never meant to be revealed. If you think this is just a normal family story, you're wrong. Subscribe now to stay tuned for more gripping episodes from us. This story began on a cold Christmas night when the whole family gathered under one roof. Happiness seemed complete. But in just one moment, everything changed forever, and I began to realize that not all secrets stay hidden in the dark. Under the shroud of midnight rain, Adelaide's city lights splintered into golden veins down empty streets, their reflections curling and pooling on rain-soaked asphalt like molten honey. It was a Tuesday, but the city felt displaced from time caught somewhere between the ancient hush of theater curtains and the electric hum of modernity. The wind, sharp and restless, rattled the neon signs outside of Hartman Ballet Studio, just a narrow doorway wedged between a noodle shop and an old music store. Steam from the rain-flecked gutters rose to meet the blur of headlights passing by each car, an afterthought in the brooding quiet. Inside the studio there was no such anonymity. Every inch was painted with intention, from the faded black and white photos of prima ballerinas who danced before the world turned digital to the mirrors that stretched like pale rivers along each wall. Here a single source of light, soft, almost spectral, leaked through the high vaulted windows. Shadows danced across the wooden floors, mingling with the sound of distant thunder and the muffled, haunting strains of Tchaikovsky's Swan Lake. In the middle of this solitude stood Aria, 16, and fragile, with hair scraped into a bun so tight it seemed to stretch her cheekbones into angles of determination. She moved with the tentative urgency of someone chasing perfection just beyond her reach. Her leotard, faded at the seams, clung to a body marked by years of repetition. Each toe calloused, each tendon pulled taut as violin string. The world outside was lost to her. The only reality was in the brutal honesty of the mirror and the promise of flight beneath the harsh discipline of ballet. Tonight was different. The rain felt heavier. The air hung with a secret. Aria's heart pounded out a rhythm at odds with the deliberate tempo of the music, and each plie, each arabesque was met with a gnawing sense of being watched, not by the audience she dreamed of, but by something colder, more insistent, pressing in from the shadows. Behind her, beyond the glass, the lights of the city flickered, as if struggling against the darkness. Her mother's voice earlier that evening played back in her mind, weary and clipped enough for today. "You need sleep." But sleep was always the enemy. The only safe place was here within the choreography she had memorized, rewritten, and punished herself with over and over. Her father's hands, rough and gentle, had tried to guide her away from the relentless self-doubt. But his reassurances always fell short against the thunder of her own ambition. The ballet shoes her parents had sacrificed so much for worn at the toes, ribbons frayed, sat neatly beside her bag, a quiet testimony to both love and expectation. She practiced long after the other girls had left, after their laughter had faded, and their voices no longer echoed in the corridor. The studio felt cavernous, haunted by ghosts of applause, the ancient timber beams groaning with memory. Each pirouette became an exorcism, spinning out the loneliness and longing that knotted in her stomach. Her movements grew more feverish as the clock crept toward midnight. The storm outside raged on a symphony of rain, hammering against the panes, thunder punctuating her jumps. Aria's phone, set to silent, buzzed with unseen messages, her sister asking if she was on her way home. Her father's missed call, a news alert about a power outage somewhere across town. She ignored them, focusing instead on the pain in her ankle, a pain she welcomed. It was proof that she was still in control. But beneath it all, a subtle shift. The sensation of being scrutinized, evaluated by eyes she could not see. The mirrors, usually her harshest critics, seemed to recede into the dark. The light at the far end of the studio flickered, casting elongated shadows that crept up the walls and converged at her feet. She paused, breath catching, sweat pooling between her shoulder blades. She glanced toward the entrance, locked as always. Or had she locked it? Doubt pricked at her. She dismissed it, but her routine faltered. The music on the ancient stereo warbled and then stuttered like a heart skipping a beat. Aria froze mid-step. For a moment, silence crashed over her thick and absolute. Then a new sound rose, a soft creak, barely audible over the storm from the hallway outside. Her heart thudded in her chest, a wild, trapped thing. The instinct to run surged, but pride held her in place. She was not a child, she told herself. No one could touch her here, not in this sanctuary. Still, she could not ignore the instinctual chill racing down her spine. She exhaled deliberately loud, as if to claim the space. But the shadows refused to yield. The streetlights flickered outside momentarily, illuminating a silhouette behind the rain-streaked glass, gone before she could focus. She shook her head. Just the storm, she reasoned, just her nerves. She glanced at the clock, 11:43 p.m. She collected her things in silence. As she slipped her ballet shoes into her bag, she traced her fingers over the small tattoo just above her right ankle, a delicate feather with a phrase in French, "Je vole encore." I still fly. It was her secret mantra, the promise she'd made to herself the day she'd been accepted into the academy, the day she'd sworn never to let failure define her. The tattoo was new enough that it still ached some nights, a dull throb that reminded her that everything real must hurt at least a little. Downstairs, the rain had grown fierce, drilling holes in the puddles outside. Aria moved quickly, hugging her coat to her body, head down. She fumbled with her umbrella, the fabric stubborn, refusing to open. Her phone vibrated again, her sister's face lighting up the lock screen, her mother's name following in quick succession. She almost answered, but something stopped her, a car idling at the curb. Its windows fogged, headlights burning through the rain. She forced herself to walk past, heart pounding, ignoring the urge to glance back. At the end of the block, she paused beneath the yellow glow of a street lamp. She glanced at her phone again, thumb hovering over the call button. But her pride wouldn't let her show weakness, not tonight. She texted a curt "Oh, I dare you" to her sister, shoving the phone deep into her pocket. A sound, soft, deliberate, broke through the patter of rain. Footsteps, too measured to be accidental. Aria quickened her pace, heels splashing through shallow rivers along the curb. Her reflection shimmered in the storefronts, fragmented ghostly, a dancer suspended in rain and neon. Behind her, the footsteps accelerated. A sense of unreality washed over her. This is not happening. Not to me. I'm not one of those girls on the news. But her body betrayed her, legs pumping, breath ragged. Her ballet bag slipped from her shoulder, thudding against the ground. She dared not stop to retrieve it. Then suddenly silence. The city seemed to hold its breath. Aria's footsteps slowed. She glanced over her shoulder. No one. The car was gone, the street empty. She exhaled, a shaky laugh escaping her lips. She knelt to retrieve her bag, hands trembling. As she straightened, a voice, a man's, unfamiliar, smooth as silk, emerged from the shadow of a nearby alley. You dance beautifully. I've seen you before. The word slithered through the rain, too close, too calm. Aria spun, every muscle tensed, searching for the source. The alley was empty, just blackness and the distant orange glow of city lights. She backed away, refusing to answer, focusing on the lit sign of the tram stop just ahead. Her phone, still in her pocket, vibrated again, an insistent pulse. She reached for it, intending to call home, but her fingers fumbled, numb with panic. The device slipped, clattering onto the wet pavement, the screen fracturing into a web of light. In that fractured second, the world seemed to shift. The storm, the streetlights, the distant whine of sirens, all faded to a low hum. The music from the studio replayed in her mind, distorted and monstrous, as if mocking her with every note. She stumbled forward, grabbing her bag, broken phone in hand, and ran faster than she'd ever moved on stage. As she reached the tram stop, breath coming in shuddering gasps, she looked back one final time. The street was deserted. The car, the voice, the sense of pursuit gone, as if erased by the rain. She stepped beneath the shelter, heart-hammering, shoes soaked. She pressed herself against the cold plexiglass, willing herself to calm down. But the dread did not fade. It settled in her bones, deep and unyielding. Inside her bag, the ballet shoes sat like two silent witnesses. Her fingers brushed the ribbons, now damp and muddy. She pressed her palm to her tattoo, closed her eyes, and tried to summon the sense of invincibility that had always come with dancing. But all she found was exhaustion, a bone-deep weariness that made her want to cry. The tram arrived, doors sliding open with a hiss. Aria stepped inside, scanning the nearly empty carriage, a man in a raincoat staring out the window, an elderly woman dozing, a pair of teens whispering over shared earbuds. No one looked at her. No one saw her fear. She took a seat near the window, forehead pressed to the cool glass, watching the rain paint wild, shifting patterns on the city beyond. She pulled out her broken phone, tried in vain to power it on. The screen flickered, then died. At the next stop, she stood and exited, boots sloshing through new puddles. Her house was just 2 blocks away, the path lined with silent hedges and sleeping houses. Each footstep echoed in the hush. She forced herself to slow down, breath steadying. A final flash of headlights swept across her as she reached her driveway, a white van idling at the corner, its engine humming. She glanced at it, then looked away, hands fumbling for her keys. The porch light was off. Her mother always forgot. She stepped inside, door swinging shut behind her, locking it out of habit. She listened, no sound but the rain battering the roof, the distant rumble of thunder. In her room, Aria shed her soaked coat, dropped her ballet bag onto the floor. She stared at herself in the mirror, the same mirror she'd used to perfect every routine. But tonight her reflection looked like a stranger. Eyes wide, face pale, lips pressed thin. The tattoo at her ankle seemed to burn beneath her skin. A single notification blinked on her shattered phone. "Are you safe?" It was her sister's last message. She typed a reply, fingers numb. "Home now." She didn't send it. Downstairs, the phone rang once, then silence. Upstairs, the window was open a crack. The curtains stirred in the storm-born breeze. Aria lay down on her bed, shoes still on, eyes fixed on the ceiling, the music of the night beating against the glass. Somewhere outside, the city continued to breathe and move and dream. But within the house, within the quiet of her room, something in the air had changed. The familiar was now strange, the ordinary tinged with menace. And when morning came, the only sign of Aria left behind was a single ballet shoe lying in the gutter outside the studio, soaked through by the relentless rain, mute witness to a story just beginning, a void where a girl once danced, and the promise of darkness that had been waiting patient at the threshold. The world did not end the morning after Aria vanished. But for those who loved her, the hours splintered and multiplied, stretching into a fever dream from which they could not wake. Dawn broke over Adelaide in a wash of sullen gray rainwater, still streaking the gutters, and a single ballet shoe, mud-smeared, sodden, rested in the gutter outside Hartman Ballet Studio, already nearly lost beneath the wheels of passing cars. It would be days before someone realized what it meant. The first responders moved with practiced efficiency. Police tape unfurled around the studio like a malignant ribbon cordoning off the sanctum that had once belonged to ambition and sweat and childish dreams. Officers in rain-spattered jackets moved in and out, clipboards in hand, their voices low and colorless, all business. The fluorescent lights of the studio were harsh against the soft gloom outside. Each mirrored wall turned the scene into a fractured mosaic, one cop photographing footprints near the door, another bagging up a waterlogged phone case, another flicking through Aria's abandoned ballet bag, with blue-gloved hands seeking a clue, a confession, a signature of violence. There was none. They found nothing but the relics of discipline and devotion, a broken elastic, a water bottle, a folded page from a dance magazine with the corner chewed. No blood, no sign of struggle. The security cameras at the entryway, ancient and unreliable, produced only blurred images of rain-soaked figures hurrying past in the night, their faces obscured by umbrellas, their identities untraceable. Detective Miller, graying with the disillusioned eyes of a man who had seen too many endings, led the inquiry. He stood in the center of the studio, surrounded by the echo of music that would never play again, and tried to reconstruct the final moments. He questioned the night janitor, whose broken English and trembling hands betrayed more fear of the uniform than knowledge of Aria's disappearance. He walked the corridors, noting how the paint peeled in the corners, how the windows rattled in their frames. The building itself seemed to mourn, but revealed nothing. At the Marchese home, the mood was at once frantic and suspended. Aria's mother, Elena, answered the door in her bathrobe, her face pale with exhaustion, hair unbrushed, eyes ringed with worry. Detective Miller's voice was gentle, almost apologetic. He had delivered this speech too many times. "We're doing everything we can. We need to ask a few questions." Elena nodded, clutching a mug of untouched tea so tightly her knuckles blanched. The interview was a slow bleed. Questions about Aria's friends, her schedule, her routines. Whether she had seemed unhappy, whether she had ever run away before. Elena's hands shook as she answered, her voice growing fainter with each query. "She's a good girl. She's never done anything like this before. She was tired lately, maybe. Maybe a little withdrawn." Detective Miller scribbled notes, gaze flickering between Elena and the framed photos on the hallway wall. Aria, at age 7, in a pink tutu. Aria and her older sister Sophia, both beaming arms around each other at the park. Sophia, too, was questioned, her answers clipped and defensive. She insisted that Aria had been fine, just stressed by auditions, by the unending treadmill of practice and schoolwork. She glared at the notepad, as though the detective's pen were a scalpel, slicing through the layers of their family's privacy. Their father, Marco, returned home midday, face gray, lips pressed into a line that never softened. He could not sit still, pacing the living room, muttering that his youngest would come home any minute now. He barely met the detective's gaze, unwilling to give voice to the fears thrumming beneath his ribcage. Day bled into evening. The news broke quickly. Teen ballet prodigy vanishes. After late practice, the headline blared, as if the pain could be distilled into a single line. The local station circled the story with the hunger of vultures, interviews with teachers, clips of Aria in rehearsal, footage of the police at the studio. The Marchese home silhouetted against a brooding sky. Reporters staked out the front lawn, calling questions as if the volume of their voices might summon the missing girl. But as the investigation dragged on and no ransom call came, no sign of violence, no blood or torn clothing, just the vanishing, inexplicable as a ghost, public opinion began to shift. The tone of the coverage sharpened. Did pressure to succeed drive teen to run away? One panel debated. Are we failing our gifted children? Another countered. They discussed her father's accent, her mother's ambitions, the family's immigrant status. Every detail was grist for the mill. The neighbors whispered, sometimes just out of earshot, sometimes not. They speculated about Elena's strictness, how she would sometimes appear outside the studio, face set, voice tense, barking instructions to her daughter after class. About Marco's distance, how he seemed to vanish into his work for days at a time, rarely attending recitals. There were rumors that Aria had recently argued with her sister, that she had become withdrawn, secretive, sometimes not coming home until late. Sophia heard these rumors at school, where whispers followed her down every corridor. Maybe she couldn't take it anymore. Her mom always seemed intense. You think she ran away with a boy? Each rumor burrowed deeper than the last, eating at Sophia's composure, until she became brittle and sharp, answering questions with icy brevity, refusing to cry in public. The police, lacking evidence of a crime, began to lean on the theory that Aria had run away, pressured by parents driven to escape by the impossibility of perfection. Detective Miller returned to the Marchese home again and again, probing gently, then more firmly. Was there anything in her behavior, any indication she might have been planning something? Elena bristled at the suggestion. She was tired, that's all. She would never leave us. Marco would not speak of it, only muttering in Italian under his breath, his grief growing harder and more impenetrable by the day. The media's gaze, once sympathetic, turned predatory. Journalists camped outside their house for weeks, flashing cameras through the windows, calling at all hours, demanding statements. Talk shows debated tiger mothers, overbearing parents, the cost of ambition. Aria's childhood photos, birthday parties, dance recitals, family vacations were splashed across every screen, every paper, as if dissecting the image of a perfect daughter might explain her disappearance. The pressure fractured the family in 1,000 invisible ways. Elena withdrew, refusing to eat, haunting Aria's bedroom at all hours, fingering her daughter's belongings, as if touch alone could call her home. Marco grew explosive, prone to sudden rages at the smallest provocation. Slammed doors, shattered plates, arguments that spiraled from trivial to brutal in moments. Sophia, caught in the crossfire, began to dread coming home, choosing instead to wander the city after class, headphones blaring, trying to drown out the voice that whispered, "You should have noticed. You should have known." Late at night, Sophia replayed every conversation with her sister, each quip, each complaint, each small, easily dismissed plea for understanding. She remembered with painful clarity the last time they had fought, Aria, eyes glistening, voice breaking, as she insisted she just needed space. Sophia, furious and hurt, had slammed the bedroom door, vowing not to speak to her again until she apologized. The words tasted like poison now. She had never apologized. Elena found solace in rituals, cleaning Aria's room, washing her dance clothes carefully, refolding each leotard, lining up the shoes in perfect pairs along the closet wall. Each item became a shrine, a talisman against oblivion. She read and reread Aria's journal, searching for hidden meaning in every sentence, every doodle. The pages offered nothing but the ordinary heartbreaks of adolescence, frustrations with choreography, longing for approval, the ache of growing up. But even the mundane was dissected, overanalyzed until meaning bled from the words. Marco took refuge in work. He returned home only to shower and change clothes, answering Elena's tearful queries with monosyllables, avoiding Sophia's gaze altogether. The silence between them widened until it became a chasm, one that no apology, no act of faith could bridge. Arguments erupted over the smallest things, whether to keep the porch light on, whether to answer the phone when reporters called, whether to accept the police's theory that Aria had chosen to leave. Each confrontation left them more splintered, more alone. The investigation churned forward with grim bureaucracy. The police canvassed the neighborhood, questioning teachers, classmates, the staff at the ballet studio. They pored over Aria's social media, hunting for clues. A cryptic post, a goodbye hidden in a meme, a message to an unknown friend. But nothing surfaced. No messages about running away. No hints of a secret romance or coded pleas for help. One afternoon, Detective Miller returned to the studio. He stood by the front window, staring out at the street where the rain had finally stopped. The ballet shoe in the gutter was gone, swept away by the city's tireless cleaning crews. The city, it seemed, was eager to erase the last traces of the missing girl. He spoke with Madame Hartman, the studio's aging founder, whose memory for detail was as sharp as ever. She recalled Aria's work ethic, her hunger to please, the way her eyes sometimes flickered with exhaustion or fear when she thought no one was watching. She was brilliant, but so young, Madame Hartman murmured. Sometimes I worried she was dancing for someone else's dream. The detective nodded, his notebook full of answers that only raised more questions. As weeks passed, the investigation ground to a halt. The trail was cold. The city's attention moved on another scandal, another tragedy. The police closed the file, marking it as pending further information. The news crews departed. The neighbors turned their curiosity elsewhere. For the Marchese family, life became a series of absences, an empty seat at dinner, a toothbrush left untouched, a silence that never broke. In the privacy of their home, Elena and Marco circled each other warily, avoiding the subject, swallowing their grief like poison. Sophia tried and failed to fill the space Aria had left behind. The world became smaller, more fragile. Every sound at night was a promise and a threat. A knock at the door, a phone ringing in the dark, the shudder of wind against the windows. Each time hope flared and then guttered, leaving only the cold certainty that the girl they loved was gone. Aria's name faded from the headlines. The hashtag stopped trending. Her classmates stopped whispering. Even at the studio, her absence became an unspoken fact, a gap in the line, a space no one dared fill. Madame Hartman kept Aria's photo pinned to the corkboard by the entrance, but the others stopped noticing. The world moved on. But for those left behind, time did not heal. It calcified, wrapping itself around the wounds, hardening the sorrow until it was indistinguishable from the person carrying it. The ballet shoe was gone. The girl was gone. The world, indifferent, kept spinning. 11 years is a long time for silence to harden into habit. In 2023, the city of Adelaide had learned to live with its ghosts. The Marchese house, its walls repainted, its curtains changed, but its air forever heavy, stood among dozens of others indistinguishable to a stranger. The world had spun on students rushed through university corridors, trams still screeched their ancient roots, and the rains returned each winter as predictably as memory. And in the fluorescent, ever-wakeful halls of Adelaide's teaching hospital, a young man named Ethan prepared to face the business of the dead. Ethan was 22, sleepless-eyed and methodical, the kind of medical student who carried his own silence inside him. He did not come from tragedy. His mother was a schoolteacher, his father an accountant, his own childhood mercifully ordinary, soccer in the park, board games on Sunday nights, a golden retriever who once swallowed an entire package of socks. But Ethan, like so many who enter the world of medicine, had learned to be quiet in the presence of pain. That autumn, he was assigned his first real experience with the morgue, a shadowed underworld tucked beneath the teaching hospital, humming with refrigerators and the cool clinical hush of institutional lighting. He arrived with a pack of nervous classmates, white coats, 2 clean shoes squeaking on linoleum, trying not to stare as the mortician, a woman with a salt and pepper braid and calm hands, talked them through the process. That day's cadaver was unclaimed. Jane Doe, 1871, the file read. Female. Approximate age late teens to mid-20s. Cause of death undetermined. Estimated date 2012. The body had been preserved in the hospital's deep freeze for over a decade, a bureaucratic anomaly. No next of kin, no one to claim the girl who had arrived without a name, whose story was written only in the lines and scars of her skin. The mortician explained that the city periodically processed its backlogged teaching hospitals, benefiting from the anonymity and legal clearance of these forgotten dead. Ethan had learned to dissociate in anatomy lab. He forced himself to focus on technique, scalpel angle, muscle identification, the methodical mapping of nerves. His hands were steady, but his thoughts wandered. He wondered who she had been, what laughter had sounded like in her throat, who had taught her to braid her hair. He tried not to look at her face. He was not the first to work on Jane Doe, 1871. But that day he was the last, the one tasked with prepping for final disposal. Alone for a moment while the others washed up, Ethan rolled the sheet down, exposing a pale ankle. That was when he saw it. A faded mark blue-black against the thin parchment of skin, a tattoo that had somehow survived the slow depredations of time. It was a bird. No, not just a bird. A feather impossibly delicate with a suggestion of motion, as if it might flutter away at the barest breath. And above it a phrase in looping script, "Je vole encore." He froze. His first reaction was embarrassment. Had he missed something important? Was this a test? But the mortician's notes made no mention of a tattoo. He leaned closer, breath fogging his face shield, and traced the letters with his gaze. French. His high school vocabulary was patchy, but he recognized the word vol, to fly. A chill trickled down his spine. Something about the tattoo unsettled him, struck a tuning fork inside his memory. Where had he seen it before? For a moment he hesitated, torn between the procedural and the personal, and then curiosity won. He pulled his phone from his pocket, ignoring the clinical ban on personal devices, and snapped a quick photo. After lab, he lingered in the corridor, back pressed to the cold tile, scrolling through the images. The tattoo was too beautiful, too carefully inked to be random. He Googled the phrase, but found only generic translations, quotes about freedom soaring above adversity, nothing that explained why this fragment of a stranger's skin made his heart beat faster. That night, sleep eluded him. He found himself back at his desk, hunched over the bluish glow of his laptop. He searched for missing persons in Adelaide 2012. Most of the cases had been closed. Others offered nothing but grainy photos and unsolved endings. At last, in a blog about cold cases that haunt Australia, he stumbled on an old news clipping. A teenage girl named Aria, last seen outside a ballet studio, vanished into rain. The article included a photograph, blurry with age. A young woman smiled at the camera, her face both radiant and shadowed, and on her ankle, a feather almost identical to the one he'd found. Below the photo, a quote, "Je vole encore," she told her sister once. "I still fly." Ethan stared at the screen chills crawling up his neck. This was not coincidence. This was a message, a fingerprint pressed through time, a story that demanded to be told. His pulse thudded, and he felt the boundaries of his world, the clean, bright certainty of science, the ordered march of medical education blur and dissolve. All that was left was the tattoo, the name, the echo of a girl's dreams. The next day, Ethan tried to push the thought aside. In the bustle of rounds, the jargon of pharmacology lectures, he tried to convince himself he was mistaken. But the image would not leave him. It hovered in the edge of his vision, nagged him in the moment between sleep and waking. It was not the clinical detachment of death that haunted him, but the sense of connection, as if the girl on the table had reached out to tap him on the shoulder and whisper, "Find me." He dug deeper. The university's library had access to the old Adelaide Register archives. He requested files on the Marchese case, feigning research for a forensic pathology elective. The librarian, a gruff man with a fondness for unsolved mysteries, raised an eyebrow, but offered no questions. For hours, Ethan pored over yellowed pages, police statements, timelines, photographs of candlelit vigils in the park, quotes from friends and teachers, endless speculation. The more he read, the more the pieces fell into place. Aria 16. A promising dancer disappeared after a late-night practice. No evidence of foul play, no note, no body. Public sympathy curdled quickly into suspicion. Rumors of a runaway, accusations of overbearing parents. The investigation fizzled. The file went cold. But one detail kept repeating: the tattoo. Several friends had mentioned it, and in one blurry group photo from a birthday party there, it was a feather on Aria's ankle, newly inked and still raw. Ethan compared the image from the morgue to the photos online. The resemblance was unmistakable. Every curve, every line matched. But was it enough? In his gut, he knew it was. In his training, he knew he needed proof. He found Aria's old blog abandoned years ago, a relic of another digital age. The posts were mundane and luminous, by turns a girl navigating the twin hurricanes of ambition and adolescence. There were photos of sunsets, snippets of poetry, and most tellingly, a series of entries chronicling the days before she disappeared. Tomorrow is everything, one read. My body aches, but my heart flies. Another Je vole encore, sometimes I need to remind myself I still can. Ethan scrolled for hours, piecing together the puzzle. The night before her disappearance, Aria had posted a photo of her feet in battered point shoes, the tattoo visible above the curve of her ankle. The caption was simple. Flight is painful, but the sky is worth it. It was all their motif language, the way her words hovered at the edge of hope and exhaustion. He felt as though he were reading the diary of a ghost. Each entry a whisper from the other side of the glass. The girl on the table, the girl in the blog, they were one and the same. How could no one have seen it before? Ethan took his findings to the mortician. She listened, skeptical, but interested as he laid out the evidence, the tattoo, the blog, the timeline. You know how many girls have feather tattoos? She asked, but her tone was softer now, less clinical. Ethan pressed on, showing her the matching phrase, the identical curve of the feather. This isn't random. She's not just Jane Doe. She's Aria Marchese. The hospital bureaucracy moved slowly, but the mortician promised to flag the file to reach out to law enforcement. Ethan was told to focus on his studies, but the case clung to him, more intimate than any other he had ever known. He dreamed of Aria sometimes as a child, spinning in circles on a rain-washed street. Sometimes as the silent figure on the table, her secrets etched into flesh. He woke sweating, his hands curled as if to catch her before she fell. He started carrying the photo of her tattoo in his wallet. He felt irrationally, as if he were protecting her. In class, while the other students joked about the macabre or gossiped about attending doctors, Ethan sketched feathers in the margins of his notes, wrote the phrase over and over, Je vole encore, until it lost meaning and became pure sound. One evening, unable to bear it, he reached out to the only contact listed in the old case file, a public email for Aria's older sister, Sophia. His message was careful, respectful, explaining what he had found, offering to meet and share more. He stared at the screen for an hour before hitting send, terrified of what he might awaken. The reply, when it came, was terse and precise. Sophia had lived with not knowing for too long. She asked him to meet her at a cafe near the hospital, a public place safe. The air charged with the potential for devastation. Ethan sat at a corner table, hands clenched around a mug, and watched Sophia approach a woman shaped by loss. Her eyes sharp and haunted, her movements careful and deliberate. He showed her the photo of the tattoo, watched as her composure wavered, as she reached out almost involuntarily to trace the outline on the image, as if the act could summon her sister back. For a moment, nothing moved. The world held its breath. In that space, Ethan understood the gravity of what he had done, not merely solving a mystery, but resurrecting a ghost, opening the door to a past that had never been allowed to rest. And in Sophia's silence, in the tremor of her hand, Ethan saw it clearly, the realization that the dead do not simply vanish. They wait patient for someone to notice the marks they left behind. Ethan stood at the edge of the city, clutching his backpack, the autumn air sharp and restless. The city of Adelaide sprawled before him, a scatter of rooftops, the spires of churches, the artery of the river. Even now, after his meeting with Sophia, the gravity of what he'd uncovered pressed on his chest like a stone. Somewhere in the mesh of old wounds and new evidence, he felt the world recalibrating, the axis of the ordinary beginning to tilt. He'd barely slept since that day in the morgue. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the feather tattoo, heard the echo of that French phrase in Aria's blog. He saw Sophia's hand trembling as she reached for the photograph, her voice a low, steady current barely holding back a tide of grief and need. The connection between them, unexpected, raw, undeniable, lingered like a bruise. Still, Ethan knew what he had to do. He couldn't carry this alone. The dead had waited too long for their story to be heard. He gathered the evidence, the photographs, printouts of the blog records from the university morgue, anything that tied the nameless body to Aria Marchesi. It was a paper trail of sorrow and tenacity, and Ethan, despite his unease, believed in the righteousness of seeing it through. He started with the police. He arranged his evidence in a neat stack, rehearsed his words as he walked up the steps to the Central District Station. The reception area was impersonal white tile, the distant buzz of radio's posters urging the public to report what they knew. The officer at the desk was young, heavy-lidded with fatigue, and met Ethan's urgency with practiced indifference. "I need to speak with someone about a cold case," Ethan began, voice tight. "Which case?" the officer asked, not looking up from his computer. "The disappearance of Aria Marchesi, 2012. Ethan replied. "I have new information. I believe I've found her." That got a reaction, a flicker of recognition, the barest quirk of an eyebrow. The officer typed something into the computer. "You're not family." "No. I'm a med student at the teaching hospital. I found a body in the university morgue, unidentified. There's a tattoo, a feather, and a French phrase that matches her blog," and the officer cut him off with a perfunctory gesture. "You're not authorized to access that file, and you're not family. If you have evidence, you should submit it to the coroner's office. We're not able to reopen cold cases without substantial new proof." Ethan swallowed his frustration. "This is proof. Just look at it. The tattoo is identical. The timing matches." "I'll take your information," the officer said, his tone sliding toward dismissal. "But unless there's more, there's nothing we can do right now." Ethan tried to press, argued the details, the urgency, the family's right to know. But the officer's face hardened, and a senior detective appeared from a hallway, asking Ethan to lower his voice and stop obstructing a public area. The implication was clear. Don't cause a scene. Don't waste our time. He left the station with hands clenched, the rejection burning. Outside, the city felt colder. The official indifference left him reeling, angry, and determined. For a moment he considered letting it go, but the image of Sophia's face, her tears, the years of not knowing, he knew he couldn't. Aria deserved more than bureaucratic apathy. He texted Sophia. "The police aren't taking me seriously. We have to do this ourselves." Sophia called him immediately, her voice calm but edged with resolve. "I can get people to listen. I have contacts. But you have to be sure." "I'm sure," Ethan said. "I've never been more certain." "Then meet me tomorrow. We'll start with my parents." The Marchesi home was different now. 11 years had shaped it into something both more fragile and more resilient. The garden, once immaculate, had grown wild at the edges. The porch light that once burned all night now flickered with uncertainty. Inside, the walls bore new photos of Sophia at charity events, newspaper clippings about child protection certificates framed and hung. But traces of Aria lingered: an old music box, a ribbon, the imprint of a girl's laughter that still haunted corners. Ethan arrived before sunset, heart drumming as he approached the door. Sophia greeted him with a nod, gestured for him to come inside. The living room was silent, save for the ticking of a grandfather clock and the faint buzz of a television left on mute. Elena and Marco sat side by side, the space between them both vast and intimate. They looked older, of course, but it was more than age. There was a weariness to their posture, a carefulness to their gaze, as if hope itself had become a dangerous thing. Sophia introduced Ethan, her tone steady but formal. "He's found something," she said. "You need to hear him out." Ethan took a breath, laid out the facts as precisely as he could. The body in the morgue, the feather tattoo identical to Aria's, the French phrase, the matching timeline, the blog posts, the forensic details, the absence of any other plausible explanation. He showed them the photo on his phone, watched as Elena's hands flew to her mouth, as Marco's knuckles whitened against the arms of his chair. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Elena broke a sob ripping from her throat, tears streaming unchecked. Marco stared at the photo, jaw trembling. He reached for Elena's hand, the two of them clinging to each other, as if to keep from being swept away by the sudden tide of grief and hope. Sophia knelt at their feet, arms wrapped around her mother's shoulders. Ethan waited, feeling like an intruder in a sacred space. But knowing this moment was necessary, a wound must be opened before it can heal. At length, Elena looked up, eyes red but burning with a kind of desperate clarity. "What do we do now?" "We go to the press," Sophia said softly. "We go to the public. We don't let them bury her again." Marco nodded. "We demand answers. We demand they look." That night, Sophia reached out to contacts at local papers, activists she'd worked with, old friends from Aria's ballet days. The Marchesi family wrote a statement, short and direct. "New evidence has surfaced in the disappearance of our daughter. We call on the authorities to reopen her case. We need closure. We need justice." Within hours, the news began to spread, a ripple through the tight-knit community of Adelaide, then into the national media. Old photos of Aria reappeared on television. Her story, half forgotten, reclaimed its place in the city's collective memory. The public reaction was swift: outrage, disbelief, sorrow. Hashtags trended again. People shared their memories, teachers, classmates, even strangers who remembered her dancing at the city fair. Pressure mounted. The coroner's office received a flood of calls. The police could no longer ignore the case. The Marchesis were no longer faceless, no longer silent. The following week, Ethan was called to the police station, not as a nuisance, but as a witness. The detectives were different this time. Alert, attentive, their questions sharp. Detective Mallory, assigned to cold cases, led the meeting. She was meticulous, listening to Ethan recount his findings, examining the photographs, asking pointed questions about the morgue records, the circumstances of his discovery. She brought in Sophia and her parents for separate interviews. Each recounted their memories, their pain, their suspicions. Elena described Aria's last days, the tension, the exhaustion, the sense that something was wrong but not knowing what. Marco confessed to guilt, the way he'd withdrawn, the regret that gnawed at him. Sophia recounted the fight, the words she wished she could take back. The detectives promised to re-examine the body, to cross-check DNA, to match dental records. They reopened the file not because of a bureaucratic directive, but because the evidence was now undeniable, the public clamoring for answers. Still, the process moved slowly. Bureaucracy, even under scrutiny, drags its feet. Ethan grew impatient, but Sophia counseled patience. "They have to do it right," she said. "We can't lose her again, not to a technicality." During those weeks, the Marchesi home became a gathering place. Journalists camped outside, old friends brought food, neighbors left flowers. Each evening, the family gathered in the living room, talking late into the night, sifting through memories, both precious and painful. Sometimes they argued about the past, about what could have been done differently. More often, they sat in silence, comforted by the presence of one another, united in hope and dread. Ethan was there, often drawn in by their courage and their vulnerability. He found himself confiding in Sophia, sharing his anxieties about medical school, about the burdens of responsibility and the cost of empathy. She listened, sometimes silent, sometimes offering quiet encouragement. A friendship, unexpected and necessary, took root. But underneath everything, the question remained. What had happened to Aria? Who had taken her, and why had her body lain anonymous for so long? The police, for their part, began to unearth the old case files, photographs, interviews, timelines. They revisited the ballet studio, now shuttered windows opaque with dust. They interviewed former teachers, students, anyone who might recall a detail that had been overlooked. A pattern began to emerge, a series of disappearances. Rumors about a mentor who promised private lessons, invitations that never led to scheduled performances. There were whispers of other girls, some who had left the academy abruptly, others whose families had moved away, explanations never quite satisfying. Detective Mallory pressed for more resources. Forensic experts compared Aria's dental records to the Jane Doe in the morgue. The match was conclusive. DNA confirmed what Ethan and Sophia already knew. The confirmation brought both relief and fresh agony. Elena and Marco were granted the right to claim their daughter's remains. A memorial was planned, small, private, attended by family and the closest of friends. The press respected their wishes, at least for that day. The city paused just for a moment as Aria was laid to rest, but there was no real peace. The revelation demanded answers, and now the machinery of justice, so slow, so reluctant, was finally set in motion. The family, Ethan, and the police now formed a makeshift alliance. Weekly meetings were scheduled, updates given, leads discussed, theories debated. The investigation widened, subpoenas for old phone records, searches of former faculty residences, background checks on every adult with access to the ballet academy at the time of Aria's disappearance. The city's arts community reeled. At first, the idea that one of their own might be responsible seemed unthinkable. But as the investigation dug deeper, old rumors surfaced about predatory mentors, about girls pressured to attend private lessons, about a culture of silence in the pursuit of excellence. Sophia used her platform as a child protection advocate to speak out, urging institutions to examine their policies, their vetting processes, their willingness to listen to the young. Talent does not excuse abuse, she declared in interviews, and ambition must never come before safety. Her words were carried across the country, sparking debate and policy reviews at dance schools nationwide. Ethan, meanwhile, struggled with his own sense of guilt and purpose. He became obsessed with the details of Aria's case, her life, her hopes, the unremarkable threads that had been twisted into a tragedy. He attended every meeting, compiled notes, researched legal precedents. He found himself haunted by the question, how many others had been lost, forgotten, misidentified? How many Jane Does waited for someone to care enough to see them? For Elena and Marco, the days blurred. Sometimes the pain was too much to bear. Sometimes it felt like breathing. But there were moments too. Moments of connection, of shared memory, of laughter at some forgotten anecdote. In those, Aria lived again, not as a victim, but as a beloved daughter, a sister, a dancer who had flown, if only for a little while. In the city, the leaves turned gold and crimson, the air crisp with the promise of change. And in a small house on the edge of Adelaide, a family gathered around their wounds, refusing to let go, refusing to let their girl be lost to silence a second time. The storm of truth, once begun, would not be stopped. There's an electricity in the Marchese house now. A crackling, feverish tension that seeps into every conversation, every meal, every flick of a lamp switch at dusk. With Aria's remains identified and the authorities finally roused to action, the city buzzes with speculation. But inside these walls, time moves both too quickly and not at all, as if the family lives in a pocket universe stitched together by equal parts dread and longing. The police deliver the old case files one evening in battered boxes stamped with dust and bureaucracy. Detective Mallory slides them across the kitchen table, her face grave but not unkind. You asked to see everything she says. It's your right now. The boxes are heavier than they look. Within their cardboard walls, photographs with curled edges, binders of transcripts, police sketches, copies of witness statements, evidence logs with yellowed pages. Each item is a fragment, a tiny, imperfect mirror of the world as it was in 2012. Ethan, ever the outsider who's somehow become family, helps Sophia unpack the boxes. Together they spread the files across the table. The kitchen soon transformed into a war room of memory and grief. Elena hovers in the background, making tea she will not drink while Marco stands watch at the window. Arms folded, his silhouette stark against the last light. They are all braced for something, revelation, redemption, perhaps only more pain. It doesn't take long for inconsistencies to surface. Sophia, with a highlighter clenched between her teeth, reads and rereads the witness statements. "Look at this," she murmurs, pushing a sheet toward Ethan. "Mrs. Hartman, Aria's teacher. She said she saw a man hanging around after class for weeks. She described him as distinguished, gray-haired, with a cane. The report says the police followed up, but there's no further detail." Ethan scans the document. Maybe they didn't think it was relevant, or maybe they just forgot. Sophia's eyes darken. Or maybe they didn't want to look. Further in, they find Aria's old journals, tattered pages smudged with graphite and adolescent dreams. The entries are sporadic, sometimes giddy with hope, other times so raw with exhaustion they're nearly illegible. But one theme recurs: he believes in me. He says I'm special. He wants me to dance in the old theater. Just us. The words jump out like slivers of glass, sharp, glittering, dangerous. As they comb the pages, a name emerges. Never quite spelled out, just M. Sometimes the patron, sometimes the mentor. The handwriting, usually so confident, devolves into jagged, nervous lines in these passages. "I'm nervous," she writes once. But he says only true artists risk everything. Ethan and Sophia exchange a glance. The mentor, he's always there, circling the periphery of Aria's story, always just out of sight. Detective Mallory joins them at the table, pulling up a chair. "We never found a last name for M. The ballet world is insular. People protect their own. Back then we focused on family, friends, the possibility of running away. Looking back, I wish we'd pressed harder. But there was no proof of foul play. No body. Nothing but rumors." Elena speaks up, her voice thin but resolute. "She mentioned someone once. Said she'd been offered a chance to audition privately. She was so excited, so nervous. She wouldn't tell me his name. Said I'd ruin it." Marco, silent for so long, lets out a bitter laugh. "I remember. I thought it was nonsense, a child's fantasy. Now I wonder if she was trying to tell us." Sophia slams her hand on the table, startling them. "We have to find out who he was. Someone must know." As the hours crawl by, they build a composite portrait from fragments the mentor's age. The description of his limp, his association with the old theater on the edge of the city. A relic shuttered years ago, still rumored to host private rehearsals, the faded grandeur of a world gone to rot. The theater itself becomes a fixation. Aria had written of it in her journal. "It feels haunted, but," he says, "ghosts inspire greatness." He brings me flowers, leaves them at the stage door. He says my pain is the price of art. Over and over the narrative of pressure and promise, the seductive lure of someone who claims to see your genius while quietly eroding your sense of self. In the hush that follows midnight, memory swells and crests in the Marchese home. The files, the journal, the endless speculation, they are all so much static unless someone can translate them into action. Sophia's voice breaks the silence. "I remember the day she came home late. It was raining. Her shoes were soaked, her hair wild. She wouldn't talk to me, just went straight to her room and locked the door. I heard her crying, but she wouldn't say why." Elena, voice trembling. "She said she wanted to be the best, that she had to prove herself. She started coming home with bruises, new blisters, always exhausted. I thought it was just ballet. Now I see." Her words fade. The kitchen is thick with the ache of what might have been prevented. Ethan tries to focus, to distill the pain into purpose. "We have a location, the theater. We have a description. Someone must have seen them. Someone must know." Detective Mallory nods. "I'll pull up property records, check for former employees, maintenance staff, anyone with access. If this man was connected to the academy, there'll be a paper trail. But that night in dreams, the evidence refuses to remain paper. Instead, it becomes memory fevered and visceral. Flashback. Aria stands in the shadow of the derelict theater, the rain turning the city's neon to watercolor. The patron is already waving an umbrella angled against the wind, his figure imposing and almost courtly in the gloom. He tips his hat as she approaches his smile, a practiced mask of warmth. "Welcome, little star," he says, voice soft but commanding. "You're not afraid, are you?" Aria shakes her head, though her hands tremble. The theater's doors yawn open behind him, a promise and a threat. Inside, the air is thick with dust and old perfume. The grand chandelier hangs caked with cobwebs above rows of broken velvet seats. On the stage, a single spotlight flickers to life. He guides her to the boards, his cane tapping a rhythm. "Show me," he whispers. "Dance for me. Just us tonight. No one else understands." Aria moves to the center spine, stiff, every sense on high alert. She starts to dance, her body moving through the familiar forms, but there's no joy, no freedom. His gaze weighs her down. He circles the stage, murmuring corrections, encouragements, biting criticisms disguised as praise. Beautiful. But pain is the crucible of art. Real dancers bleed for their craft. She pushes through, desperate to please, her muscles burning. When she stumbles, he's at her side in an instant, steadying, then holding a fraction too long. There. All greatness is born from suffering, Aria. The rehearsal is endless. Her vision blurs, but she does not dare stop. When she finally collapses, he crouches beside her, brushing sweat-matted hair from her face. "You mustn't tell anyone about our rehearsals," he says. "People wouldn't understand. They would try to steal your gift, poison your future. I'm protecting you." His words weave into her mind, an intoxicating poison. He gives her a rose thorns pressed against her palm, a prick of pain. "Promise me, Aria. Promise you'll keep our secret." She nods, tears burning her eyes. She is 16, and in that moment she is both queen and captive. In the present, Ethan wakes from the dream, heart hammering. He knows with a certainty that terrifies him that this is more than paranoia. It is the anatomy of manipulation, the slow isolation, the rewarding of secrecy, the conflation of devotion and obedience. The mentor's tactics are classic predator, cloaked in the language of genius, using the structure of art to shape vulnerability into dependence. He tells Sophia what he's realized, speaking softly so Elena and Marco don't hear. He broke her down, then built her up again in his image. Every compliment had a hook. Every private session was about control, not growth. She was too young to see it for what it was. Sophia's face is pale, but her jaw is set. "We have to expose him. Even if he's dead, even if no one wants to believe it, we have to tell the truth." Detective Mallory returns the next morning with news. She's found the mentor's name, Maurice Delacroix, a celebrated but controversial choreographer who left the academy under a cloud of scandal years ago. Rumors, but no charges. He fits every description: the limp, the cane, the gray hair. He owned the old theater for a decade, hosting private lessons for promising students. He died in 2019, a stroke alone, no surviving family. Elena's hands clench at the tablecloth. He took her from us, and no one stopped him. Sophia is already thinking ahead. There must be others. We have to find them. We have to make sure this never happens again. The family's pain is incandescent, but it is a pain with direction. Together they compose a public statement naming Maurice Delacroix, telling Aria's story in full for the first time. It's carried by every major news outlet, interviews, op-eds, retrospectives on the dangers of unchecked power in the arts. The fallout is immediate. The Ballet Academy is inundated with calls, former students coming forward with their own stories. Investigations are reopened. Policies are changed overnight. And through it all, the Marchesi family navigates the torrent of attention with stoic grace, their grief now a weapon against silence. But inside, the battle continues. Every day they swing between hope, the hope that Aria's truth will save someone else, and terror, the terror of facing the enormity of what was lost, of what can never be restored. The love that binds them is now mingled with the bitter taste of betrayal and regret. In the end, they sit together, the files stacked neatly once more. The journals return to their drawer. Outside, the city is waking up, light glimmers on the horizon, and the world turns. The darkness has not been vanquished, not yet, but it has been named, its outlines traced and shown to the world. And in the quiet that follows, the Marcheses understand justice is a mosaic of broken things pieced together with patience, with fury, with love. And Aria, in her absence, is finally seen not just as a victim, but as the girl who dared to dance even in the darkest part of night. They waited until the city was asleep. It was the hour when Adelaide seemed to breathe shallowly, its arteries of traffic quiet, its lanes pooled in shadow, its hidden places blinking into anonymity. Sophia's car, an old blue Corolla that coughed to life on the third try, coasted through the nearly deserted streets. Ethan sat beside her, silent fists clenched in his lap, eyes darting from street lamp to alley as the old theater drew near, growing in his vision like something summoned. The world outside those windows was awash in spectral light. The moon, high and bloodless, cast long blue-gray fingers down the street. The theater loomed suddenly more ruined than building, its old facade chipped and split, the once gold marquee missing half its letters. Shadows pooled in the entry alcove. It was a relic, a wound waiting. They parked a block away. Neither spoke. Their movements were rehearsed, necessary, brittle. Sophia pulled a flashlight from the glove box, checked her phone, no signal. Ethan zipped his jacket, bracing himself. Their breaths fogged in the cold. Neither admitted it, but both knew they weren't just trespassing for evidence. They needed to cross this threshold to see for themselves the place that had eaten Aria alive. A broken side door yielded to a determined shove, hinges squealing in protest. Inside, the air was thick with dust and neglect, a sour trace of old perfume lingering beneath the scent of mildew. Their footsteps echoed two hollow notes in a cavern of velvet rot. The darkness felt alive, shifting and listening, crowding them with memories not their own. Ethan swept the beam of his flashlight across the foyer, faded posters. Some corners gnawed by mice, a line of ticket stubs in a dusty bowl. The grand stairwell curled upwards, but they took the narrow hall to the right, following Aria's diary entry. Down the corridor, past the red curtain backstage where he waits. The silence was nearly total, except for the muted sigh of wind pressing through a cracked window. Every so often, a sound would ricochet, a settling beam, a loose screw making them freeze, certain for a heartbeat that something was behind them. Sophia gripped his arm. We're almost there. The backstage door groaned open, revealing the ghost of a stage. Even in decay, it was beautiful. The board scuffed by 1,000 performances, a single spotlight dangling by its cord. The velvet curtain still a vivid red in the flashlight's path. Ethan's heart thudded as he stepped onto the boards. The air felt charged, as if years of applause and longing still vibrated in the wood. Sophia moved to the wings. Her diary said he hid things here. Props, music sometimes. Gifts. She swept the flashlight across piles of decaying costumes and set pieces, a rocking horse, a broken chandelier. Dust motes swirled in the sudden light, thick as memory. Ethan's beam landed on a battered trunk. He knelt, fingers trembling as he worked the rusted clasp. Inside, sheet music, a faded bouquet, ribbons stained with something dark, and a small leather-bound notebook, Aria's. The pages were warped ink smeared, but he could make out the writing. He called Sophia over, heart climbing into his throat. They crouched, reading by flashlight. The entries were shorter, more frantic. He's angry when I make mistakes. The more I try, the more I fail. But I have to keep dancing. Further in, the handwriting staggers. He says I'm nothing if I stop. I believe him. I have to. Who am I if not a dancer? Sophia's hand flew to her mouth. A sudden metallic click made them both freeze. From the opposite wing, a faint light flickered, an ancient cassette recorder, its red LED glimmering in the dust. Ethan crossed the stage, heart pounding, and pressed play. The speakers whined. Static then, Aria's voice thin and shaky. For whoever finds this, if you hear me, please tell my family I tried. I did everything he asked. I'm so tired. I'm so tired. Silence, then the scrape of a chair and his voice cold and precise. Again from the top, show me you can still fly, Aria. A scratchy recording of piano begins, Swan Lake, distorted by time. The sound of footsteps, then the rhythmic thud of point shoes. Breathless counts 1, 2, 3. Faster he barks, and her breath quickens, breaking until there is only sobbing layered beneath the music. The tape cuts off with a violent clatter. Sophia drops the recorder, tears streaking her face. Ethan kneels, grief twisting in his stomach. She left a message. She wanted to be found. He lifts the recorder, searching for more tapes. In a cracked jewelry box, he finds them 6 more, all labeled with dates in Aria's shaky script. One by one, they play them. They listen to her unravel her hope, her desperation, the careful way she tries to hide her fear in technique. She counts her steps, tries to breathe through the pain, whispers mantras to herself. Je vole encore, I still fly. But by the 4th tape, something changes. Her voice is dull, detached, her cries of pain sharper. The mentor's voice grows harsher, the piano's tempo manic. If you stop, you're nothing, he repeats. If you fail, you disappear. In the final tape, her voice is barely audible. If I can't dance, I'm no one. He says so. I think I believe him. The air in the theater thickens, as if Aria's agony still lingers, a fog that seeps into skin and bone. Sophia sobs openly, hands pressed to her face, rocking. Ethan wants to run to smash something, to tear the world apart for letting this happen. Instead, he wraps an arm around her, anchoring her in the present. The pain reaches its apex, a jagged, unsparing truth. Aria was not just taken. She was broken down, remade in his image, then abandoned to darkness when her body failed. They see it, feel it, as if watching through her eyes, the way the mentor isolated her, drilled her to exhaustion, whispered poison until she believed her worth was measured in suffering. They move through the theater as if searching for absolution. Following faint traces, a scrap of costume, a heel mark on the dusty floor. In a cramped dressing room, they find her initials carved into the paint, the date etched below the night she disappeared. Sophia collapses into the old armchair, clutching the diary to her chest. She was so close, she whispers. So close to coming home. Outside, the night presses against the shattered windows. The city, oblivious, sleeps on. But within the theater, the siblings face the ghost of Aria's suffering, the raw edge of what she endured. They promise aloud and together that her voice will never be silenced again. In the final moments, Ethan places the diary, the tapes, the broken ribbons in his backpack. We'll bring this to Mallory. We'll make them see. Sophia nods, wiping her eyes, her voice a low vow. No more secrets, never again. They leave the theater as dawn begins to smudge the horizon, carrying with them the last fragments of Aria's truth, her pain, her courage, her longing to matter, in a world that only loved her when she danced. Morning broke sharp and cold over Adelaide. The air felt metallic, every sound brittle, every movement loaded with the strange clarity that sometimes follows nights of horror. The Marchese house was full of people, but hollow at its core. Ethan, Sophia, Elena, and Marco moved from room to room with the slow, deliberate gestures of survivors. No one mentioned the tapes or the diary. Those had been surrendered to Detective Mallory before dawn, the artifacts too powerful, too dangerous to keep close. The only words spoken were in soft, practical tones. Coffee toast updates from the investigation, but beneath each syllable simmered grief and rage, circling each other like animals in a pit. At the precinct, Mallory moved quickly. She'd heard the tapes read Aria's desperate journal and seen the initials carved into the paint backstage at the ruined theater. She ordered the old Ballet Academy's personnel files, cross-referenced property records, and requested hospital archives. It didn't take long. The paper trail of Maurice Delacroix, once so carefully hidden, was now stark and damning. He had been a star, lauded in interviews, quoted in textbooks, invited to galas and symposiums. His protégés had danced on stages from Paris to New York. And always on the periphery, rumors, talented girls who left, suddenly whispers of private lessons, parents who grew uneasy and withdrew their children, but never pressed charges, never dared speak out. Sophia sat with Ethan in the waiting room, hands clenching a foam coffee cup until it nearly buckled. "It's him, isn't it?" she said, not as a question, but as a grim certainty. Ethan nodded. He'd spent the night replaying the tapes in his head, each shout and command echoing in the echo chamber of his mind. The old man's voice was unmistakable, the way he hissed praise through gritted teeth, the cold command in every instruction, the expert manipulation of Aria's yearning. "They can prove it," he said. "They have enough." Mallory emerged, eyes shadowed by too little sleep and too much sorrow. She confirmed what they already knew. Hospital records showed Delacroix had suffered a stroke and died alone 4 years earlier. In the final years of his life, he'd grown reclusive, vanishing from public view, relinquishing his hold on the academy and the theater. The only eulogy he received was a brief notice in a dance magazine, no mention of his protégés, his triumphs, or his crimes. But the evidence was overwhelming. The timeline aligned his ownership of the theater, his secret lessons, his documented dismissal from the academy after disciplinary concerns. The tapes and the diary formed the spine of the case. The final blow was a hospital note filed by a nurse that described Delacroix's confusion in his last days, muttering in French about the girl who could not dance anymore, about the cost of genius, about sacrifice. He died babbling her name. The Marcheses returned home with the news devastation crashing over them in fresh waves. Marco, who had once believed in justice, stood at the kitchen window, fists clenched, breathing in slow, shuddering gasps. Elena wept quietly, her hands clutching a rosary she no longer believed in. Even Sophia, who had steeled herself for this moment, felt her resolve splinter. She retreated to Aria's old bedroom, clutching a pillow to her chest, letting silent sobs shake her to the bone. Only Ethan moved. He prowled the edges of the house, unable to sit, unable to speak, rage churning inside him. Not just at Delacroix, but at the system, at the culture of silence, at every adult who had looked away. The house was suffocating with sorrow and with guilt, the two indistinguishable in the sharp morning light. In the quiet that followed, memory became weapon and wound. The tapes played again, but this time inside each of them, the scenes as vivid as nightmares. Flashback. The rehearsal room is suffocating. Delacroix stands behind Aria, cane in hand, his voice a knife slicing through the air. "You are weak today. Did you sleep? Are you committed to this or not?" Aria tries to answer, her voice barely a whisper, but he cuts her off. "Again, if you want to be great, you must hurt. No greatness without pain." She pushes herself until her muscles spasm, until every nerve screams, until the blood leaks through her slippers and stains the floor. When she stumbles, he sneers, "Pathetic. Is that all you are?" And she bursts into tears, unable to answer. He circles her like a predator, voice now soft, dangerous. "You know what happens to dancers who disappoint me. There are always others. I made you. I can unmake you." And in the corner, the battered tape recorder spins. She rehearses not just her dance, but her apologies, her desperate attempts to earn his praise, to stave off his wrath. When he grows tired, he turns away, muttering, "Rest if you must. But remember, if you stop, you're nothing. If you can't dance, you're no one. You are not Aria. You are only movement, only perfection." There are days when she believes him, days when she repeats his words back to herself, when she feels her own self dissolving, replaced by the persona he's sculpted. But at night, in the dark, she clutches her ankle fingers, tracing her tattoo, "Je vole encore." The words a desperate plea, a last tether to the world beyond the studio. The confrontation reached its dreadful apex the night she fell. In her journal, the last entry is a scrawl. He says, "If I can't dance, I can't stay. If I can't stay, I am nothing." There are bloodstains on the page. The medical examiner's report lists a spiral fracture, untreated, worsened by repeated exertion. That night, Delacroix forced her through the routine again and again, each misstep punished with sharper words, colder contempt. When she collapsed, he left her alone, injured and terrified. He locked the door and waited for her to crawl back. But she couldn't. He came back hours later. By then, the trauma, the shock, the blood loss, her body couldn't hold on. Delacroix, the master of every scene, tried to cover his tracks, hid her body, erased her name, let rumor and bureaucracy do the rest. He relied on silence, on the world's willingness to look away from the suffering of young women, especially those who had once seemed so strong. In the present, Ethan's fists ache from clenching. He cannot bear the injustice, cannot bear that Delacroix will never stand trial. will never face the faces of the families he shattered, will never be named as a monster by those who matter most. But there is more. As Sophia pores over Aria's last notes, she recognizes the classic signs of Stockholm Syndrome. How Delacroix's approval became Aria's only son. How the boundaries between fear and devotion dissolved. She sees in her sister's words a plea for help that could never be uttered. He loves me. He hurts me. I need him to believe I'm worthy. If I fail, I lose everything. I lose myself. The family gathers, reading aloud passages that tremble between hope and despair. They see how in the end Aria could not escape, not just the theater, not just Delacroix, but the trap of her own longing to matter. Her talent became her prison. Her dreams, the bars. Even as her body failed, her spirit clung to the idea that pain meant purpose, that to stop dancing was to die. Rage and grief blur together. Marco paces, shouting at the ceiling, demanding an answer. Why her? Why did no one see? Elena rocks in her chair, whispering prayers, blaming herself for every missed sign, every time she urged Aria to practice, every hug she did not give. Sophia curls up with Aria's diary, vowing that her sister will never be a nameless victim. Not now. Not ever. Ethan stands at the window, jaw set, a single tear tracking down his cheek. He vows to carry Aria's story forward, to ensure the world sees her not just as a casualty of ambition, but as a warning, a beacon, a call for justice in a world too quick to forget. The truth is monstrous. It is heavy, but it cannot be hidden any longer. In the end, as dusk settles once more over the house, the family finds each other in the living room. The pain is bottomless, the wounds fresh, but for the first time they speak the whole truth. They remember Aria's laughter, her defiance, her stubborn hope. They hold each other a circle against the night, swearing that her name will live on a light against the cold, implacable dark. The world is forever changed, but so are they. The day the press conference was announced, the Marchesi house awoke with a strange hush. A pause between breaths, between storms. Rain ticked at the windows, the clouds bruised and swollen, as if the sky itself had conspired to hold witness to this reckoning. There was no breakfast, only strong coffee. Sophia ironed a plain blouse. Elena checked her phone for messages she both dreaded and craved. Marco stared out at the wild, overgrown garden hands tucked deep in his pockets, his back so straight it looked carved from stone. Ethan arrived early. He barely spoke, offering only a nod and a brief squeeze to Sophia's shoulder. He had spent the morning reviewing his notes, drafting a statement he would never be asked to read. In the weeks since the discovery, since the tapes and the diary and the final damning hospital record, he had been transformed, less the jittery medical student of months before, more a vessel for someone else's pain, determined to see this story through wherever it led. At the precinct, the air was electric with anticipation. Journalists clustered in the foyer, laptops, open recorders, ready, the din of their whispered theories swelling and collapsing with every fresh rumor. The city had not seen a story like this in years, a case gone cold now, exhumed, its rot and tragedy exposed to the merciless light. The whole of Adelaide seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to see who would answer for what had happened to Aria Marchesi and for the unnamed girls before her, and the ones who had survived in silence. Inside the conference room, Detective Mallory's team moved like a single organism. Papers shuffled, microphones checked, a whiteboard scrawled with a timeline, a photograph of Aria at 16 beaming out from behind a row of police badges. It was not lost on anyone that there was no mugshot of Maurice Delacroix, no image of the man who had orchestrated so much pain. Death had protected him from the humiliation of justice, but not from its final naming. Mallory took the podium, her presence a combination of fatigue and iron. She spoke with deliberate clarity, her voice measured but unyielding. After a comprehensive review of forensic evidence, newly recovered personal effects, and the diligent work of our team and concerned civilians, we can now confirm that Aria Marchesi, who disappeared in June of 2012, was a victim of kidnapping and homicide, perpetrated by the late Maurice Delacroix, a former ballet professor and mentor. The words landed like thunder. She detailed the timeline, the diary entries, the tapes, the witness statements that for too long had been ignored or discounted. She named Delacroix, described the pattern of predation, made it clear that Aria was not alone. In light of this evidence, Mallory continued, we are reopening investigations into the disappearances of other young dancers who were associated with Delacroix and the Hartman Academy during his tenure. We urge anyone with information to come forward. Questions came fast and urgent. How many girls? How did this go unnoticed? What about the academy, the administrators, the teachers? Mallory stood her ground. We will be conducting a full review of institutional practices and personnel from the period in question. There is a systemic failure here, one we are determined to address. Her words went viral before she had even finished speaking. News outlets pushed notifications to millions of phones. By noon, Aria's face and the tragedy of her story had become national, then international news. And for the first time, her name was no longer followed by speculation, rumor, or blame. It was attached to the word justice. The aftershocks tore through the arts community like an earthquake. The Hartman Academy shut its doors for restructuring and reflection. Ballet boards and theater councils convened emergency sessions drafting statements that walked a careful line between contrition and self-preservation. Mentorship programs were suspended overnight. Anonymous hotlines for victims of abuse lit up with calls. Women and men dancers, actors, musicians came forward, their stories tumbling out in a chorus of rage and sorrow. Some spoke to the media. Others wrote letters to the Marchese family expressing regret, solidarity, or their own private burdens. For many, it was the first time they'd ever spoken of what had happened to them, behind closed doors, in echoing studios and empty rehearsal spaces. They described the manipulation, the isolation, the way praise was used as currency and silence as a weapon. Some had escaped, others had not. Some survived, others had not survived in any way that counted. In Parliament, a hastily assembled committee began drafting new laws, mandatory background checks for mentors, stricter reporting protocols, confidential counseling for students. These were small, imperfect steps, but the momentum was undeniable. For once, the machinery of power was listening, if only because the city and the country was watching. Sophia found herself pulled into the whirlwind. She was asked to speak at conferences, to consult on policy, to recount the pain of her family in the language of advocacy and prevention. She did so with a measured ferocity, her voice never breaking her message, never diluted. Genius should never come at the cost of innocence, she told a roomful of reporters. And silence is never protection. Elena too found herself transformed. The grief had not lessened, but it had changed shape. For years she had blamed herself, convinced she had been blind too, demanding, too distracted. Now, with the truth laid bare, she allowed herself to forgive, not just herself, but Aria as well, for being young, for trusting, for never finding the words to say she was in danger. Elena began to volunteer at local youth centers, teaching dance to young girls, but always with an eye for safety, for consent, for the fine line between discipline and exploitation. Marco moved more slowly, his wounds deeper, his recovery less visible. He tended the garden, fixed what he could around the house, but rarely spoke of Aria. Yet he began to join his wife and daughter at community meetings, quietly, always at the back of the room. When asked, he would say, "I'm here so no one else has to be." He forgave, if not the world, then at least himself, and learned to hold his grief as a kind of legacy. The family grew close again, though the shape of their togetherness was different now. There were still arguments, small necessary ones, about chores, about plans for the future, about the way Aria's old room should be kept. But there were also new rituals, Saturday breakfasts, evening walks, the telling and retelling of the good memories, so they would not be eclipsed by the horror of what followed. Sometimes on quiet evenings, they would pull out the old photo albums and laugh at the awkward, beautiful child Aria had been, her wild hair, her crooked grin, the stubborn set of her jaw. It was an act of defiance, of reclamation. Aria belonged to them, not to her killer, not to the city, not to history. And in these moments, they learned to live with the loss, not to let it define them, but to allow it to inform their love for one another. Sophia stayed with her parents longer than she had planned. The three of them circling each other, sometimes colliding, but always coming back together, always finding a way to say "I love you," or "I'm sorry," or simply "I'm here." As for Ethan, the experience had changed him irrevocably. He returned to his medical studies with a clarity he had never known before. The bodies on his slab were no longer just anatomy lessons, but lives with stories, stories that sometimes ended in cruelty, in mystery, in a silence that only science or perseverance could break. He approached his studies with a new rigor, but also with a deep sense of responsibility, haunted by the idea that sometimes the truth was not just a clinical matter, but an act of love. Ethan spent his evenings in the library poring over forensic psychology texts, studying patterns of trauma and abuse. He volunteered at the coroner's office, learned from pathologists who understood that justice often began where hope ended. His classmates joked that he'd become obsessed with Jane Doe's, but Ethan didn't mind. He had seen the cost of forgetting. He was determined never to let another story be buried, never to let another Aria Marchese disappear beneath the weight of neglect. One night, after a long shift, he sat with Sophia in a corner cafe, the rain smearing the windows into a blur of city lights. "You could do anything," she told him. "Why this?" He thought for a long moment, watching the steam rise from his cup. "Because sometimes," he said quietly, "the dead have no voice, and if I don't listen, if someone doesn't listen, no one ever knows what happened to them. No one ever brings them home." Sophia reached across the table, her hand warm on his. In that gesture, Ethan felt not only forgiveness, but an invitation to carry this work forward, to find purpose not just in science, but in justice, in compassion, in bearing witness. The city began to heal in its own slow and imperfect way. Flowers appeared at the steps of the old theater notes and drawings from girls who had never met Aria, but who now danced for her, danced for themselves. A mural was commissioned on the side of the academy, an enormous feather streaked with blues and golds. Aria's signature in the corner, "Je vole encore," I still fly. The Marchese family stood beneath it one bright morning, the sun finally breaking through the clouds. They posed for a photo, not smiling, not quite solemn, simply together, the four of them present and accounted for. It was not a happy ending, but it was a true one. The case file was closed. But Aria's name, her story, her warning, her hope lived on, woven into the fabric of the city. And for every child who dreamed of greatness, for every parent who watched with fear and pride, for every teacher who now understood the price of trust, there was the faintest promise that what happened to Aria would not happen again, not if they could help it. For Ethan, for Sophia, for Elena and Marco, it was enough, not justice, not absolution, but something like peace. They learned to forgive, to endure, to remember. And in that act, Aria, brilliant, broken, beloved, flew again, not in suffering, but in the freedom her memory had finally won. Adelaide was waking from a long winter when the first invitations went out, a night of remembrance, a celebration, a vigil for Aria Marchese. The city had changed in the years since her story surfaced, the streets humming with the aftermath of reckoning, but also now with something gentler. Healing, perhaps, in fits and starts. As the season shifted, so too did Adelaide's pulse, from whispered regret and shame to the tentative bright notes of hope. The concert hall chosen was not the old haunted theater where darkness had once gathered, but the heart of the city's new arts district, a modern space of glass and blonde wood, all open light and sweeping lines. It felt deliberate, a public statement that art and memory would not be buried in the past, that beauty must exist in the daylight, claimed and celebrated, not hidden in fear. Flyers appeared on street corners and bus stops. Invitations slipped beneath doors, and into school lockers announcements played in the lull between morning traffic reports. The entire city was called to bear witness. On the morning of the memorial, the sky was as blue as porcelain. Volunteers gathered at dawn, working in silence to drape the hall's stage in thousands of white flowers, lilies and roses, gardenias and hydrangeas, pure as falling snow. Dozens of children and young dancers, some who had trained with Aria, others who had only known her story, arrived with bouquets in their hands and ribbons pinned to their leotards. The house was soon filled with the murmur of voices, the shuffle of ballet shoes, the nervous laughter of those about to step on stage, and the low humming chords of an orchestra tuning up in the pit. Ethan arrived with the Marchese family, each of them marked by the years, Marco's hair whiter, Elena's posture more delicate, Sophia's confidence tempered by the scars of loss. But they walked together their steps in time, each hand reaching for the other. Ethan, for all he had witnessed and done, still felt the weight of outsider-turned-family, a role he wore with humility and pride. The foyer teemed with friends, journalists, city officials, artists. Yet as the Marcheses entered, a hush rippled outwards, as if a collective breath had been drawn in anticipation. The seats filled. On stage, the orchestra's first violinist signaled silence, and a single spotlight swept across the sea of white. At the podium, the new director of the Adelaide Youth Arts Centre, her face young, but her eyes steady, welcomed everyone. Tonight, she said, we gather not only to mourn a life lost, but to celebrate a spirit that refuses to fade. Aria's memory is our promise that the dreams of our children will be safe, that their gifts will never again be used against them, that art belongs in the light. The first movement was Swan Lake Aria's favorite. The city's ballet company had invited students and professionals to share the stage, a living tapestry of generations. Each dancer wore a small feather embroidered with the words, Je vole encore. The youngest, a girl of 9, hair braided with white ribbon, opened the dance. Her movements were hesitant at first, the trembling of nerves visible. But as the music swelled, she found her center, and the trembling became grace. The audience sat rapt, some weeping openly, others squeezing the hands of loved ones in the darkness. Between the dances, the lights dimmed and a series of projected images bloomed above the stage photos of Aria as a child, as a student, as the fearless, radiant girl who had once dreamed of flying. Short videos supplied by her friends and teachers played out Aria goofing off backstage, teaching younger dancers their first steps, her laughter ringing out like bells. I want to dance until I disappear, she says in one recording, eyes, wide voice full of wild hope. The crowd, hearing it now, rippled with a collective ache. Sophia was called to the stage next. She stood in the center, her face pale but resolute, a single white rose clutched in her hands. She read aloud a letter Aria had written, never sent, discovered only after her death lines, about fear and longing, about wanting to matter, about the terror of failure and the hope of someday inspiring others. When Sophia's voice faltered, Elena joined her, laying a hand on her daughter's shoulder, and together they finished the words, "No one should dance alone in the dark. We deserve to be seen." A thunder of applause, followed by silence, as a line of girls stepped forward, each bearing a single flower, placing it at the edge of the stage, a growing wave of white, impossibly beautiful, impossibly sad. Then came the dedication. The mayor took the podium, her voice trembling with the weight of what was owed. It is my honor to announce the founding of the Aria Marchesi Center for the Protection of Young Artists. Here children will find mentorship, not manipulation, guidance, not exploitation. The center's symbol, a feather in flight, reminds us of Aria's spirit and of our promise to future generations. Behind her, a great banner unfurled, a painted feather, luminous and bright, Je vole encore, curling beneath it in Aria's own handwriting. The crowd erupted in applause, tears on many faces. In that moment, the symbol was more than a memory. It was a vow, a living public act of resistance against the darkness that had claimed her. The concert resumed. Dancers twirled and leaped, not in the service of perfection, but in joy, in remembrance, in solidarity. The orchestra played pieces that Aria had loved, music that soared and swooped now and then, dipping into melancholy but always rising, always finding the light. There was no fear on stage, no harsh instructor's voice, no demands for sacrifice. Only movement, only beauty, only the purest form of what Aria had once chased. In the audience, the Marcheses sat hand in hand, Ethan beside them. Sophia pressed between her parents, their arms tangled together. For the first time in years, the tension had dissolved. Tears streamed down Elena's cheeks, but her lips curved in a small, fierce smile. Marco wept openly, clutching his wife and daughter, the weight of grief transformed, if only for tonight, into a fierce pride. Ethan, who had come to know Aria through tragedy, felt her presence not as pain, but as invitation. In every step, every chord, she was there, dancing, flying free. At the end of the night, the stage was crowded with children, parents, survivors, teachers, people who had come to bear witness to say, "We remember. We are changed. We will protect our own." The director called for silence once more, and Sophia stepped forward with the final words, her voice strong, the hall's hush absolute. Nghệ thuật phải được bảo vệ bằng ánh sáng, không thể tồn tại trong bóng tối độc ác. Art must be protected by light. It cannot survive in darkness. The words hung a benediction in order. There was no applause, only a long, aching moment of stillness. Then, a wave of arms raised in solidarity, of hands, joined of hearts, opened. The city changed in small ways after that night. The Aria Marchesi Center opened its doors, flooded with applications, with volunteers, with survivors seeking a place to heal, or a chance to ensure no one else would suffer as they had. Its logo, a feather in flight, began to appear everywhere, on dance studio doors, on school posters, as a charm on necklaces and backpacks. It became a shorthand for courage, for vigilance, for hope. Parents, emboldened by the Marchese's fight, demanded more from schools and mentors. Students learned that the true mark of genius was not silence, but safety. Not suffering, but joy. In classes across Adelaide, teachers found themselves changed, kinder, more aware, sometimes uncertain, but always present. A new generation of dancers emerged, proud and loud, and fiercely protective of one another. For the Marchese's, healing was not a straight path. There were nights when Elena woke crying, dreaming of Aria's final days. There were mornings when Marco, lost in the garden, thought he saw his daughter in every shadow. Sophia carried guilt and pride in equal measure, working long hours at the center, mentoring, listening, ensuring no story would be ignored. Yet in these small rituals, these acts of devotion, the family knit itself whole again, choosing every day to remember Aria as more than her ending. Ethan graduated his ceremony, attended by the family who had taken him in as one of their own. He began his work as a forensic pathologist, driven not by morbidity, but by devotion to the dead and the living alike. Each case was a promise, each victim a reminder he would not let their voices fade. He volunteered at the center, teaching children the basics of anatomy, helping them understand their own strength, their own agency. Sometimes when the work was heavy, he would visit the mural at the Arts Center, Aria's feather painted in sky blue and gold, and whisper his own vow to keep fighting. As the years passed, Aria's memory took on new shapes, a scholarship in her name, a prize for compassionate teaching, an annual concert that drew dancers from across the country. Her story was woven into the fabric of Adelaide, no longer a wound, but a warning and a wish. Her voice, captured on tape and in letters, was shared in classrooms, her handwriting reproduced in the margins of every center handbook. Each anniversary, the Marcheses gathered at the center at the mural, sometimes at home where they danced in the kitchen, hands clasped, laughter mingling with tears. They carried her forward, not in sorrow, but in joy, in the fierce insistence that Aria would never again be lost in the dark. The last note of the memorial concert lingered in the air as the crowd stood unwilling to let go. Outside, the city shimmered in the dusk windows, a light the river shining. A breeze caught the feathers scattered across the stage, lifting them, spinning them, sending them spiraling upward, up into the rafters, out the doors, into the world. Adelaide, for all its scars, was not finished with healing. There would be more darkness, more stories to unearth, more names to speak. But tonight in the concert hall, the light held. Aria's name glowed untouchable, unbreakable, a promise that no child, no artist would ever again have to dance alone. And in the hush, after in the space between music and memory, the city dared to believe in beauty and in the unbreakable, necessary power of hope. The hall is empty now, save for a lingering hush, a memory of applause that floats in the air like dust caught in fading spotlights. Someone kills the stage lights. Shadows sweep across the polished floor, swallowing the rows of white petals and silent chairs. For a long moment, nothing moves. No orchestra, no dancers, no sound but the gentle groan of settling wood and the distant rush of nighttime traffic beyond the glass walls. But then, from somewhere backstage, comes a single tentative sound, the soft, rhythmic whisper of ballet shoes gliding across old boards. It is a sound like a heartbeat, alive with longing. In the darkness, a figure appears. A little girl, perhaps 8, pale leotard, glowing like a ghost. She moves tentatively at first, then bolder, tracing the same steps Aria once loved, the same arabesques and pirouettes. She's not alone. Her classmates follow a line of children tumbling out onto the shadowed stage, their laughter hushed and hopeful, their faces turned toward something unseen. Off to the side, Sophia stands in the wings. She is older now, so much older than she intended to become, but her gaze is clear and gentle, her presence a steady beacon. She calls out quiet encouragements, gestures with her hand again from the top. The children watch her, hungry for guidance, and she gives it her words, low and warm. Her hand steady as she molds a small foot, straightens a trembling back. Sophia kneels beside a trembling boy, his hair sweat damp and his eyes uncertain. "I get scared sometimes," he whispers. "What if I forget the steps?" She smiles, brushing the hair from his forehead. "It's okay to be afraid. You just have to keep moving. Even if it's only a little bit at a time." In the wings, parents watch, some holding hands, some wiping tears. Elena and Marco are among them. Faces marked by time, but open soft, shining with pride and sorrow. And something more, something like peace. Ethan stands nearby, his arms folded, head bowed. They do not speak, but their hearts beat in the same fragile, hopeful rhythm. The lesson ends, but the children linger. Sophia gathers them in a gentle circle. She kneels, so she is at eye level, her voice carrying through the darkness. "Remember," she says, "no one is ever forgotten. No one is ever left behind. You are all here together, and together you carry each other's dreams." A girl raises her hand. "Is that what the feather means?" She points to the painted mural above the door where Aria's feather floats, brilliant sky blue, impossibly light. The tattoo that changed everything now, a symbol stitched into bags and journals, painted on mirrors, inked onto new skin. Sophia nods, voice catching only a little. "Yes, it means we keep going. That every time you dance or help someone else dance, you help another dream take flight. Even if you don't see it right away, you are never alone." The children file out, voices, bubbling, tiny hands clutching shoes and ribbons and feathers cut from colored paper. The hall empties, the last lights dim. On the stage, dust motes swirl where dancers once spun. Sophia stands alone for a moment, eyes closed, breathing in the hush, the memory, the blessing. She traces the line of the feather on her wrist, her own tattoo now inked in Aria's script, a silent promise. She hears faint and impossible the echo of her sister's laughter, the quick thud of point shoes, the old unbreakable melody of hope. From the shadows a breeze stirs, cool and gentle. It slips through the cracks, brushes the stage, and the sound is unmistakable footsteps, light and bright, spinning across the boards, Aria forever dancing, forever keeping watch. A guardian of small dreams, a whisper against forgetting. In that final moment, as night folds around the empty hall, the feather glimmers in the dark, a thread of light stretching backward and forward, weaving memory into hope, pain into strength, and one lost girl into a legacy that will never fade.